I want to continue today with our discussion of Eliyahu Navi, Elijah the prophet, with a specific focus on connections between his story and Tehiyat Metim, the resurrection of the dead. But before doing that, I have to refer to previous Shilo, the previous discussion of Eliyahu, in which I tried to make a conditional prognostication about what's happening in Israel right now, saying that if the nation is ready to unite around the principle of turning away from foreign gods, in this case, by rejecting the authority, both the practical political authority and the moral authority of the United States, if the nation's ready to turn away from the US, to reject the US, to dismiss the US, and is ready to do that across a lot of different sectors of society, then reading Eliyahu, there's good reason to think that HaKadosh Baruch Hu might take that as enough of a turn towards him that it's a kind of national unity that he would reward with great success, with stunning success, perhaps. And I think I've been hopeful that we might see that coming from different quarters. And there was maybe some evidence from rhetoric that that kind of a turn could be happening in more than one sector of the political leadership. Sadly, since then, it's been clear that Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, and Benny Gantz, the other member or voting member, let's say, of the war cabinet that's running the war that we're fighting in Gaza and against Hezbollah in the north, really, currently, that both of them have made open plays in the direction of supporting the American position about how Israel is handling the war. And that's very saddening because I think at least that means that we're not going to see this kind of real unity of principle and purpose across the current leadership of the war cabinet and more generally of the government. That doesn't mean necessarily that the nation can't be united around the same principle. And it still, is the case that we have reason to hope that if enough of the nation, from religious to secular, from left to right, however you want to slice things up, rallies together under the banner of the Americans don't know what's best for us, they don't know what's right, and we're going to do what's right and what's best for Am Yisrael, and we're going to seek victory in order to survive and thrive in our land. If that were enough of a unifying principle for enough of the nation, I think we still could expect Bezrat Hashem to see great things. But it's becoming clear that we're not going to see that kind of unity driven by the leadership of people like Yoav Gallant and Benny Gantz. It would have never been something that one could have reasonably hoped for, given what one already knows about them. But around the time of Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut, the Memorial Day, and the Independence Day of the State of Israel, they were kind of fainting in the direction, talking the big talk about the invasion of Rafah, and sounding like they were joining Netanyahu in adopting this pose of, if we have to stand against the whole world, then we will, and we're going to do this the right way. But subsequently, it seems like they are trying to chart a more compromised and corrupted path in which They try politically to undercut Netanyahu by staking out a position that pits him against them as the more reliable allies of US policy in the current government. And that means that, at least from the leadership, we're not going to get the kind of unity that we need. That doesn't mean we can't get it from the nation. It doesn't mean we can't get it from the people rejecting this kinds of gamesmanship and this kind of prostration before foreign gods. So B'ezrat Hashem, we'll still see it, and we'll still be successful and victorious with the Yad Hazaka of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the strong hand of Hashem, helping us along the way. But alas, it seems like it's going to take a little bit more time than it might have if Gallant and Gantz had shown a bit more backbone and not turned out to be shills for the U.S. State Department. It is an interesting point, as a side note, that when reading Tanakh in general, it's frequently the case that Nevuah, the prophecy that we read in Tanakh, is not simply making some statement about what definitely will happen, but rather is providing a framework for anticipating what might happen if people make certain choices and make certain decisions. That if you go one way, then this might happen. If you go another way, then that might happen. And so the exciting thing about that is that Tanakh, to some degree, provides us with a model framework for decision making, right? That we can look at different instances of what's happened in the past and try to map them onto the present and actually understand something about how things might go under different scenarios and try to find the thread, and find the path through the jungle, so to speak, and figure out, okay, so what does HaKadosh Baruch Hu want us to do here? What are the different choices that are before us? And so in this current instance, it's possible to say, if the nation makes a certain choice, then we might expect to see certain things. And if it doesn't, then we may have a rocky road ahead. That's v'chalila. So let it be the case, B'ezrat Hashem, that the nation figures out that at this point it's not merely foolhardy, but even dangerous to develop policy at a national level based on recommendations from the U.S., because the government of the U.S. does not have the best interest of the nation of Israel at heart. And even if it did, it doesn't have the understanding of our situation to make useful recommendations about how we should handle this war. Now, turning to Eliyahu and his contest in Har Carmel, in Mount Carmel, with the prophets of Baal. We had talked about some aspects of that competition before, and today I want to just focus briefly on how it's related to Tchiyat Mitim. Tchiyat Mitim is the resurrection of the dead. And I think that there are different ways into this subject. One of them is midrashic, where we see from the comment from Chazal, from the sages, that there are these three keys that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has: the key to the womb and the grave and the skies. And that there's this discussion of how many of these keys were given to Eliyahu and how he had to give one back so he could have another one. So what are Chazal really talking about there? Really what they're getting at is that at various points in Sefer Melachim, in stories of Eliyahu, in the Book of Kings, you have reference to Eliyahu talking about the rain's not coming, so that's obvious, the keys of the sky. But also at a certain point, Eliyahu seems to revive a boy, a son of a woman who helped him, who seems to have died, and Eliyahu brings him back to life. And then also there's this story with Elisha that happens later. Elisha is the student of Eliyahu, where almost the same thing happens with a woman's son who's a boy seeming to die and then being brought back, in this case by Elisha. But that boy had also come into being in a more sort of Abraham and Sarah kind of way, where a woman didn't have a child and she wasn't able to conceive one. And then Elisha tells her that she's going to have a child. So the child comes into being, and then he seems to die, and Elisha brings him back. So those are the three different topics, right? There's the sky, there's the womb, the child coming into being, and then there's the grave, bringing someone back to life. And so you have these three different themes running through these different stories, which are connected in structure. Well, the rains thing is an overarching thing throughout the whole story of Eliyahu, but then like the two stories about the boys that die, it's almost like a repetition of the same story, except that we bring the womb in sort of the barrenness of the mother in the repetition of the story. So it's not even really an interpretation. It's black on white there in the text that you have revival of the dead, and also the idea of childbirth, and also the idea of bringing the rains or stopping the rains. So Chazal, when they make this comment in the Midrash, they're really picking up on pretty obvious things in the text that are close to the surface. But now the question is, what does it mean that those three themes are being connected by the text of Tanakh itself? Is there anything about rains and the womb and the grave that have anything to do with each other? And we had a longer shiur a while ago about Chiyat Metim, about the resurrection of the dead, where we had a discussion about possible connections between those concepts. And in rapid fire, I will just mention that the focus of that discussion was this moment in Beit El, also known as Luz, where Yaakov lies down to sleep on some stones of Anim, and then when he wakes up from an Evan, a stone. So there's this sense of stones becoming a stone, in other words, things that seem irreparably broken apart becoming one again, which we tried to argue is an evocation of the idea of the resurrection of the dead, the putting back together of things that seem hopelessly broken apart. And maybe that might be a bit much to try to build on top of this one shift from plural to singular and describing the stones happening in Beit El. But Chazal, sages, kind of tell us that that's right, because they have all of this midrashic reference to the idea of Luz, the city of Luz, as being a special place where one can avoid the angel of death. There's a midrash about King Solomon, for example, that has to do with the city of Luz. And you could quibble about, is it this Luz or that Luz, or is there more than one place called Luz, etc. But fact is that the word Luz is mentioned in the context of Beit El in the Torah, and Chazal pick up on Luz and say Luz has something to do with escaping death. And we went further in that previous shiur by saying, Luz is also mentioned as a kind of tree branch that Yaakov is using when he's doing all of his animal husbandry and crossbreeding animals to try to get ones that have stripes or spots or whatever. And that's interesting as well, because that has to do with animal heredity. And if you wanted to really go deep into the bonus footage, so to speak, you could say, okay, the ladder of a messenger or an angel ascending and descending that Yaakov sees in his dream when he's in Beit El, that's evocative of DNA, if you like, and DNA is the heritable material that transmits traits from one generation to another. But even if you don't want to go there, because it's obviously only a certain kind of reader who wants to attribute that kind of foresight to the text, you can still say that the idea of animal heredity is also evoked through the connection from Luz, where Yaakov has his dream in Beit El, and Luz, the infrequently mentioned plant species that Yaakov also uses a short time later when he's doing his animal husbandry. And so we have this idea of birth and the reproduction of animal traits associated with Luz. And we also have this idea of stones coming together and becoming one stone, which maybe is the resurrection of the dead. And of course, Yaakov calls the place in Beit El Sha'ar HaShamayim, the gates of heaven. So we're also, the gate of heaven being open or closed seems to have a big deal, or rather a whole lot to do with whether or not it's raining. If you just think in, very narrow descriptive terms. So you maybe also have subtextually reference to the womb, birth on the one hand, the resurrection of the dead on the other, the grave, and the skies and the rains. So all of that we had to work on this passage with Yaakov and his angels and his dream and the ladder and everything in order to get that. But at some level, it's much clearer in the text in Sefer Melachim. So for example, when at the transition from Eliyahu to Elisha, where Eliyahu is about to sort of disappear, there's all of this moving around that happens. And it's interesting that it happens in places like Beit El, which is explicitly mentioned, and also Har Carmel, which is where the contest with the prophets of Baal happens, and where the rains eventually come. And so Beit El is actually entangled with this whole sort of transition from Eliyahu to Elisha in the text, which makes it not so complicated to now bring this story about Yaakov in and try to compare it. But there's really yet more that we can try to bring in as well, because that same passage also mentions, and now we're going to try to run the thread through a bunch of different passages at once. That same passage mentions Jericho. And Jericho is the place of the crossing of Yehoshua when he brings Bnei Israel into the land. And when they cross, the Jordan splits, and there are these 12 stones for the 12 tribes that they take from the bottom of the Jordan. But 12 stones for 12 tribes is what we see when Eliyahu builds his altar in Har Carmel to do his demonstration. So Yericho, Beit El, and Har Carmel together, we're starting to talk about, okay, the miraculous splitting of waters, and also the 12 stones for the 12 tribes, and also the reference to the resurrection of the dead and the womb and the skies in this moment where Yaakov is in Beit El. And all these things are being threaded back and forth through these different passages. So all of that, might seem a little bit tenuous, but really all of that is a preamble just to try to give a little context to focusing on this moment where Eliyahu is building his altar in Har Carmel before the rains come. And I think the comment I ultimately want to make, the case I want to make here, is that there are two kinds of things we can learn from studying this particular passage. One of which is going to be that we maybe understand something a little bit more about what Tchiat Metim is like. Like what does it mean to bring the dead to life, as far as Tanakh understands? And also, what does that have to do with national unity? Because what we argued before was that this whole thing with Eliyahu was about national unity. It was about taking Yisrael and Yehudah and saying, no, there's 12 tribes that come from Yaakov. That's one nation. We need one nation again. HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us to be unified. He wants us to be unified around turning away from foreign gods and all of that. So what does that have to do with Tchiat Metim? What does that have to do with the resurrection of the dead? And how can we understand national unity better in light of some concept of Tchiat Metim? So those are the two kind of questions. First, let's just focus on Tchiat Metim. So Eliyahu builds an altar, and the altar, he has a specific arrangement of components or ingredients that he includes, other than the bovine animal that is being sacrificed on the altar. There's the etzim, the wood. There's the channel that he digs around the altar, which he fills with water. And it's 3 times 4 kadim of water. So kad is like a jar. So he does 12 splashes of water, but it's done in 3 different stages of 4. So we have 3 times 4 makes 12. There are the 12 stones for the 12 tribes of Israel that are mentioned. It also mentions that the amount of water that could be put in the trench that he digs around the altar is 2 sa'ataim of zera, so like a certain portion, an agricultural portion, a quantity of seed that you could put into this ditch. And when the flame comes down and consumes the offering, it consumes the altar. And it says also not just the altar, but the stones and the water and the wood, the etzim. And it mentions somehow the afar, the dust or the dirt, which wasn't mentioned in the construction of the altar, but it's implicit, I guess, in the fact that he's digging in the dirt in order to make this trench. So that's the whole set of ingredients that we want to consider. And I think there are a few aspects to that worth mentioning. The basic point is what we already said, that Tchiyat Metim as putting stones together, that we get from Yaakov and Bethel, but it also is present here. We know Eliyahu already is associated with Tchiyat Metim, with the resurrection of the dead, because of a narrative in which he actually brings this boy back to life. And by the way, the mention of kad, the jar where the water is being poured on, that word kad appears earlier on when the woman who's the mother of the child is sharing her food with Eliyahu. So you have this, kad, and the water is being put on 3 times. Eliyahu, when he lies on the child, he lies on him 3 times in order to bring him back to life. So you have a number of different elements of parallelism there. He takes him up to some kind of upstairs portion of the house in order to do this. And so the aliyah that's mentioned, the trench that's dug around the altar is ta'ala. So again, you have this ayin lamed word repeated. So although the shoresh there is in principle different, but since taf sometimes is a grammatical particle, it's pretty easy still there to see a resonance. The point is that there's a number of different things between these 2 passages, that connect them, and so it's not difficult to say, okay, 12 stones put together into one would make some kind of sense of putting the body back together, of resurrecting the nation out of the tribes of which it's composed that are split apart, and that similarly would evoke the idea of reassembling a living body out of the sort of parts of it that have fallen apart. And it is notable that flame that comes from heaven, from Hashem, consumes the whole thing, right? That there's some sense of these are the components, you put them together, and the whole thing is acceptable to Hashem. So there's some notion of the living thing as a whole being recognized by the acceptance of this offering. But I think there are a few other elements in this that are interesting. One of which is this idea of water, and not just water, but water that's in this channel, this ta'ala, this sort of trench, but a trench that contains the idea of a channel through which water could flow, if you look at other uses of the word. And it's obviously not going to flow anywhere, around in a circle, so to speak, if you're just doing it, digging a trench around an altar. But the point is, he's not just pouring water only on the altar itself. There's a sense of there's a body of water, and there's kind of a linear body of water that's surrounding the altar, like a river. So that is interesting because if you take river water and you combine it with the question of Tchiyat Metim, of bringing the dead to life, you'll notice, for example, that when Moses is pouring water on the ground and it's becoming dam bayabeshet, blood on the dry ground, it's not just water, it's the water of the Yaor, it's the water of the Nile. The idea of river water being connected with making living blood is something we have in the Torah, that there's a recognition that you need some kind of flow, that water in that context is about life, because water is about motion and about bringing sort of mass flow and energy flow into the equation. And on top of that, there's also a sense in which there is, a mention of afar, right? So when the altar is built, there's no mention of afar, but when the offering is kind of accepted by the flame, so to speak, afar is mentioned. And afar is this word that's used in the context of the forming of man in Gan Eden, in Sefer Bereshit, and also it's about the death of man, right? Uli afar tashuv, like you shall return to dust. So the mention of afar strongly connotes the notion of this boundary between life and non-life and the sort of transition in each direction. And that has been introduced by the text when we're talking about this moment where Eliyahu's offering is being accepted. And furthermore, there's a notion of miraculousness, even before we actually see the offering being consumed, because once you have a river and you have 12 stones for the 12 tribes of Israel, that evokes this moment before we mentioned with Yehoshua crossing the Jordan, crossing the Jordan. So that is like a miniature splitting of the sea that happens for the tribes as they enter the land of Israel. And the 12 stones that Eliyahu puts in, along with this sort of channel of water that he's put around the altar, evokes that as well. So there's this sense of remembering, like Hashem can make wonders for you, Hashem can split the sea for you. But that happens in a particular context. It happens when you're doing what he has commanded you to do, when you sort of followed him to the sea to leave Paro behind and go to the land. Then he'll split the sea for you, right? Or he'll split the Jordan for you, the Jordan for you, because you're entering the land. So that there's this sense of, because we want to be a united nation, not the United Nations, but a united nation, a unity of tribes that's going to go to the land and serve Hashem there together according to his Torah, that in that merit we have this kind of capacity to see the sea split. But the point is that element of sea splitting or wondrousness is also contained there in this altar in a way that would be kind of necessary for us to see it as also being an emblem of Techat Mitim, of the resurrection of the dead. But I think lastly, perhaps the most interesting thing is this mention of the time of Zera, the measure of, 2 measures of seed. That's just a detail tossed in of exactly how much volume could have fit in this trench that Eliyahu dug. Because what it brings in is the idea of Zera, of seed. And seed brings in the idea of birth, right? So it's a reinforcement of something that we already mentioned in the Midrash, or really going the other way. This is where Chazal are probably getting the Midrash from, right? What they're saying is the text is teaching us something about Chiyat Metim, that there is a relationship between these 3 things, right? There's the womb and the skies with the rain and the grave. And the idea of coming out of the grave is not unrelated to the idea of coming out of the womb or the idea of bringing the rains, right? That there is when it comes to the rain, a sense of you can have conditions where it's just impossible for a cloud to form, and then something changes in the conditions, and then things that were unthinkable and impossible suddenly become possible, and suddenly you can have condensation of moisture, and suddenly you can have raindrops falling down, right? That it's the case that at a certain temperature and at a certain humidity, the idea of rain is unthinkable, right? It's not going to happen. But that once you turn certain knobs, the things that seem impossible and like they could never happen, suddenly they are what's normal and what's favored, what's typical in the current in a certain situation. And indeed, Chazal in Masechet Ta'anit, they compare Tiyat Mitim to the condensation of raindrops. It's like the idea of something that's spread out and dispersed suddenly under different conditions can collect back together. And of course, the condensation of the physical form of a human being is a much more complicated thing to envision than the condensation of a raindrop, where all the water molecules are ostensibly identical, and it's just a matter of colocalizing at a greater density and sticking together because things are colder. But in order to understand how it's more complicated, what the text brings in by this mention of Zera, and what Chazal bring in by this mention of the womb, is the idea of embryogenesis and childbirth, right? We know of an example of how it's possible to have a bunch of dispersed, inanimate, inchoate materials brought together and assembled into an exquisitely complex structure of a living thing. That happens in the context of embryogenesis and gestation and childbirth, right? So to say, well, that could never happen because once you're dead, you're dead, and we've never heard of such a thing as, taking things that have fallen apart and putting them back together. Well, the womb does put them back together. Like, we don't think of it in that way because we don't think of childbirth as being the recreation of something that was before. We always think of it as the creation of something new. But I think part of the point that Chazal are identifying in the text and commenting themselves is that if it's the case that it's possible to make something new, like a new living thing, a baby, that exists for the first time, that itself is so wondrous that it becomes very hard to say, well, of course, that wondrous thing is natural and normal, but I can't possibly conceive of something like the reassembly of a living person with a particular sort of body plan or what have you. That would be too wondrous, right? I totally get how it's possible that you can take a single cell and turn it into a person, and that works. No one actually totally gets that. It's a wondrously complex process. Of course, we can make progress scientifically in understanding it, but development is very difficult to make complete sense of, because of all the different levels of regulation and coordination that have to happen in order to take something that was at one point one cell and give it, in the right environment in the womb, the opportunity to grow into something that's a whole human being. And so it's still very much a work in progress to understand how that works, even if you treat it, as a scientizable natural phenomenon. So it doesn't make sense to say, oh yeah, that I take for granted, that's easy, that's normal, that's natural. But the idea of someone who died somehow coming back to life, that's inconceivable because once you fall apart, you're apart. Well, embryogenesis takes things that are apart and inchoate and puts them together and makes wondrously a unique living thing. So is there something in that process that shows us the potential for that to happen, for someone who has died? That's the idea, I think, that the text is raising. And it's not saying, okay, here's how you do it, or it's not saying, yeah, this will happen every Tuesday, but it's saying, don't think that you know what's possible or what's impossible. Think of something you take for granted as being normal and natural that actually is so wondrous and so difficult to fully understand that maybe it opens your eyes to the possibility that there's some other wondrous things that you haven't seen yet, but that could be also in the offing, depending on circumstances, right? Depending on, the weather, so to speak, if it's cold enough for raindrops or if it's whatever enough it needs to be so that you can rebuild a body. And I think that that idea is captured by this mention of zera, this mention of seed, right? The two se'atayim of zera in the altar of Eliyahu, it's connoting the notion of growth of life from a seed. So it's mentioning the womb, but it's also about Chiyat Mitim. It's about putting those stones back together. It's about taking the 12 separate tribes and reuniting them and assembling them into one, like the stones under Yaakov's head that turn into one stone, seemingly in the text in Bethel. And to the degree that that's the case, it's saying, look, seed is the way this is done. And that is interesting because, again, midrashically, Chazal talk about something called the etzem luz, the luz bone, which is supposed to be this kind of seed from which you can reconstitute the human being and the sort of indestructible essence of someone who dies that could be used to reconstitute the rest of them. And isn't it interesting? The mention of the wood in the offering is the etzim. But eitzim can be a play on words. It's like atzamot, like bones. That it's a very close hop from eitzim over to something where we're talking about bones instead of about wood because of this ayin tzadi mem that you get from pluralizing the etz, the wood, into eitzim. So I think that. It's interesting in its own right just to consider what we're getting from Eliyahu and say, okay, so if we accept that there's enough kind of basic parallelism to concepts related to Tchiyat Mitim in other contexts in Tanakh, then this maybe more explicitly brings in the idea of seed as or growth from a seed as part of what that looks like. And I'll mention as well, again, if you're looking for the sort of bonus material that is more directly related through some kind of prophetic insight to what we know about DNA today, same way with Yaakov, where we have the ladder of ascending and descending messages in Luz, one might mention. There is also something evocative one can't help but noticing about the two se'atayim, right? So like two strands, and the 12 buckets of water that get dumped on everything, which are broken into 3x4 sets. Because 3 and 4, when you talk about DNA, there's the 3 DNA bases of the codon, and there are 4 different kinds of DNA base that go into the DNA. So 3 and 4 together is very DNA related numbers. But again, you can take or leave that if you want. I don't think it's necessary for us to make the point that we're making. But in any case, we've gotten to the point of saying, okay, so this is this rumination on Tchiyat Metim, on bringing what was dead back to life. But now we have to ask, well, what's the point of that? Why? I mean, so Eliyahu was doing something that has to do with Tchiyat Metim. We see elsewhere in the text where he kind of explicitly does that. But what is Tchiyat Metim about, such that it matters in the context of this story with Eliyahu, which really is about other things? It's about this competition with the rain god, the prophet of Baal, the prophets of Baal, and it's also about, as we mentioned, national unity, about Israel and Yehuda coming back together. And interestingly, if you go to Sefer Yehezkel, if you go to the book of Ezekiel, the most famous passage, perhaps, in all of Tanakh connected with the idea of Tchiyat Metim, of the resurrection of the dead, is this Valley of the Dry Bones passage in Ezekiel, where the prophet is being told to, prophesy over these dead, dry bones in a valley, that they should have ligaments and flesh again, and that they will live. And there's an image of resurrection of the dead there, but really what that passage ultimately ends up being about is about the resurrection of the nation, where Hashem goes on to say to Yechezkel that he should take 2 pieces of wood and write the name of Ephraim on one of them and write the name of Yehuda on the other and put them together and make them one plant, right? Like grafting sort of, and saying like, look, these were separate tribes, but now there's going to be one living thing, which is the remainder of Am Yisrael, and it's not separately Ephraim and separately Yehuda. It's not these split apart tribes. It's one thing who will henceforth be, in one sense or another, the Jews, right? But you have the idea of Eitzim, like the wood being put together, but also there's mention of bones in that passage. But what it's saying is, look, this concept of Tchiat Mitim, of resurrection of the dead, is all about the joining of tribes into one whole. And the way that that's achieved is that they aren't separate broken stones. They really are living things. And that passage in Yechezkel is kind of showing you, like, these aren't things that are irrevocably broken apart because they're both pieces of a living thing, like a tree that could be sort of grafted together and become one plant. And so you have to remember, in a sense, tribes that seem irrevocably split apart. The reason they can go back together is because they're actually alive, and living things can join and fuse and evolve together and become one thing. And that is perhaps the important practical implication of the idea of Tchiat Mitim for this altar of Eliyahu, that Eliyahu is making this offering that's acceptable to Hashem, where it's about bringing the nation, the split apart tribes of the nation, back together into one thing. And the question is, how is that made possible? How do we achieve it? It seems like it takes a miracle. What makes it feasible? And if the goal is to create one nation out of these separate split apart tribes that seem to be going their own way, what mechanism is going to enable that? So there may be more than one point to make there, but I think the interesting thing is, because we're talking about stones and 12 stones associated with the 12 tribes of Israel, and all these passages we've already mentioned, like Tchiat Mitim, if the central text for Tchiat Mitim in the Torah itself is this moment where Yaakov is in Beit El and he has the stones under his head become a stone. What's interesting is that in Beit El, he makes a matzeva and pours oil on it, right? So the matzeva, this word matzeva, it's like a pile of stones, right? He can make a construction out of stones that is a sign between him and Hashem. But what's interesting is that at the moment where the Torah is given, that's where we have 12 matzevot of stone that are made, right? That when Moshe is receiving the Torah at Sinai, there's this mention of 12 different matzevot for the 12 different tribes of Israel. And so that, or I don't know, maybe you could quibble and argue differently how to read the text. Maybe it's one matzeva that's made out of stones for the 12 different tribes, but there's an explicit mention of 12 tribes and this pile, this matzeva, that generally is made of stone when it's described in the Torah. So I think that where this leaves us then is that it actually helps maybe to cheat a little bit when we're thinking about Tchiat Mitim as being about having to do with DNA, let's say. And we don't really need the idea of DNA, but it helps us as moderns to express what we mean. That if Tchiat Mitim has an element of coming from a seed, right? And if we're trying to understand, how do you unite the nation? How do you bring the irrevocably broken apart pieces of the nation back together, as though you're trying to bring a living thing that has fallen apart back to life and reunify its pieces? That's supposed to be impossible. But if what makes Tchiat Mitim possible is some notion of growing from a seed, right? Or, so to speak, reconstructing the body from the DNA, then in the case of the nation, what is the seed, right? What is the DNA? How do you reconstruct the nation? How do you reassemble the nation? What's the plan for that? And that's, I think, the reason that this thread running through piles of stone and the matzeva that you have with Yaakov in Beit El so strongly evokes this repetition of the same phrases, and he got up in the morning, so to speak, when Moses makes these matzevot for the 12 tribes of Israel at the giving of the Torah. The Torah itself is the seed, right? The Torah itself is the DNA. That if you want to know what is the plan for how you reassemble the seemingly irrevocably broken apart pieces so that they can become one living whole again, the essence of that, right? The tree of life, getting over to Yechezkel with putting the living pieces of a tree together, right? The essence of that is that the Torah itself provides the basis for that. That if you're going to take things that seem broken apart and different and unrelated and put them together, they're not split apart, cracked stones that can never be reunited. They are living things that can evolve and develop and grow into one thing. But the seed for that, the DNA for that, the plan for that wonder of biology is the Torah, right? And that's what the reference to this idea of matzevot of stone for the 12 tribes, these 12 stones for 12 tribes, is going to evoke for us, at the time of Matan Torah, the giving of the Torah, right? That we need the Torah as the blueprint for the resurrection of the nation, right? That at some level, yes, Am Yisrael lived and survived in exile for a long time and developed into these kind of separate tribes that are very hard to put together at some level. But what we have seen, practically speaking, much like the sort of condensation of raindrops in the last 100 years, is so many different kinds of Jews from all over the world condensing together into the land of Israel and suddenly trying to sort of work out as a living thing how to become part of one whole again. And that's very difficult and produces a lot of friction and striking of sparks, however you want to put it. And it's not a complete process yet. And sometimes it seems like it's a doomed process because there's so much difference and disagreement and machloket or dispute about what this is all about and how we should be doing things, etc. And I don't think that the point is to say, oh, so yeah, we just need to get everyone to keep the Torah and then it will be fine. Like that sort of assumes the conclusion at some level. The challenge is, at one level, how do you get some kind of broad basis for agreement about what everything is about? But not surprisingly, what the Torah is saying is, look, if you want to take a whole bunch of people who are, in a sense, from different tribes, from different sort of worldviews and different places that have come together into one place and have them be one nation again. If you want to see the resurrection, the real resurrection of Am Yisrael, the bringing back of Am Yisrael from the dead after being scattered and dispersed as though dead as a nation for thousands of years in this sporulated state, holding on by one's fingernails and surfing through the millennia and waiting for this opportunity. If you want to bring that whole nation back to life and reconstitute it fully in its body in the land of Israel, then what you need is the Torah. The Torah is the DNA. The Torah is the seed. The Torah is the basis for that growth and that development, that life, that evolution that can produce the living thing according to the plan that reassembles all the different seemingly disparate and irrevocably broken apart pieces together in the right way. And that doesn't mean it's obvious how to implement that, and it also doesn't mean that it's as simple as saying, okay, yeah, so everyone should keep the Torah and then everything will be fine. But it is making a general point that if we're going to try to chart that course of how to guide the nation towards that greater unity and coordination, we're going to find the sort of the wisdom of how to do that in the Torah itself. And it's not necessarily going to be about making sure that everyone is on exactly the same wavelength and thinking about how they keep the Torah, but it does mean that we need to recognize that when we bring Am Yisrael, the Jewish people, whatever you want to call it, from all over the world together into one place, and say, let's make a nation out of this group of people in some kind of a melting pot scenario, the common basis for all those groups of people that is the only possibility of really creating a substantive unity in the nation as a whole is the Torah. And that means like the common heritage, the common shared national DNA, so to speak, is the thing that is going to help us to figure out how to fit things together. And in the end, there are different tribes, and those tribes have genuinely different characteristics, right? Yosef is very different from Yehuda. And Yosef, we know as a personality, is very practical and scientific and very oriented towards the rest of the world and the economics of how to succeed in the rest of the world, and is not very prophetic and is not very ascetic, and you could almost say is kind of a deist at some level who pushes Hashem into the background and just talks in terms of like, let's do what's right and let's do what's practical. That is Yosef as the personality, and that also is perhaps an aspect of Am Yisrael as a whole, that we're not looking to cut off or extirpate, despite the fact that what I just described is troublingly divorced from what we often call religion or faith, right? That is something that has been with us as part of the nation, who we are for a long time, having to deal with that worldview and that temperament, that personality, and having to try to keep it despite the fact that it produces all this conflict as between Yosef and Yehuda and the other brothers. And then you also have, the other personality, the sort of the Yehuda, the shepherding tribe, that wants to wander through the desert and relate to Hashem and build a mikdash or a mishkan, build a temple or a tabernacle for him, etc. And those things need to play together. And that's the intention of Hashem, that we figure out how to bring Yisrael and Yehuda together into one nation. And the secret of how to make that work is there in the Torah for us to understand, not by narrowly requiring that we somehow all get in line, along some narrow track and keep the Torah exactly the same way, but that we all relate to it as the real common heritage that we share, and that forms the basis for our figuring out how to be one nation united in our relationship to Hashem.